number of calories that people and animals are able to consume means that horses are starting to get much bigger than elsewhere in Europe. People are starting to get much bigger than elsewhere in Europe, not always upwards, but sideways as well.
Welcome to Echoes of History, Anton. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
I'm really excited to find out more about the Age of Invention. So Assassin's Creed Syndicate plonks us in London in 1868, and it's quite different from the other entries in the Assassin's Creed canon in that we're living in a much more what we would call a modern age, I guess. It's the most recently set game, and that brings differences for the player. So they have a train, so their base can keep moving around. They have a telegraph facility, which means propaganda can be spread super fast. And all of this has come around on the back of what we call the Age of Invention. So I wondered if you could start off, could you place for us the Age of Invention in time? What kind of period does that cover?
So for me, the Age of Invention starts around 1600. Think of the Age of Shakespeare, and takes us all the way through to about 1850s. I'm even kind of a bit beyond that as well. So there's almost like a second Age of Invention with the telegraph, the telephone, all these other electrical inventions and then chemical inventions in the late 19th century. In many ways, we're actually still living through it. So the big change that happens is with the Industrial Revolution, which you might actually really call a kind of acceleration of inventions and acceleration of innovations. Over the course of that period, we're essentially still living through that because we still kind of expect there to be an improvement to pretty much everything that we use every year. We want a better iPhone, we want a better TV. We think that dishwashers, washing machines, everything gets better and better and better. But that trend of gradual improvement in absolutely everything, in all different industries, is essentially something that starts in that 17th century, 18th century, 19th century period.
And is there a way to mark the beginning of the Age of Invention? How do we kind of pinpoint the start of it in time?
It's a tricky thing to do because it's an acceleration. So you've kind of got a few glimmerings of something that's happening in the late 16th century even. So I would say, even the kind of the age of Elizabethan explorers, the kinds of navigational techniques they're picking up, even, this very slight stuff in terms of very small changes to navigational instruments, the way that they would hold them, the techniques that they're using. Those are the sorts of things that are already starting to give English merchants the edge. They're giving the English Navy the edge. And then that kind of compounds already into the early 17th century, where England starts to look particularly unusual. So I think there are a few kind of signals that you can see that something is going on. One of them is that you've suddenly got the rise of the English as a kind of shopkeeping nation, as a nation of merchants. The other is that you see this wholesale shift towards usage of coal. So instead of just burning wood in people's homes, burning coal in people's homes, that's something that takes place over the course of the 1580s to 1600. London suddenly makes this huge, very dramatic, rapid switch to what is basically an inferior, very stinky, sulphurous, smelly, sooty fuel, but able to burn it in people's homes without, suddenly having your eyes streaming, coming out of the room, coughing and spluttering, as well as adopting it in various different industries. So in brewing, in drying the malt that you'd use in brewing, in making glass, in making pottery, and eventually making iron as well. So you've got this wholesale shift towards a completely new fuel, which then frees up all the land that would have been used for fuel, that would have been used for wood, that would have been used for digging out peat and turf for marshland, heathland, the kind of furze and ferns and gorse that you'd collect from heaths. All of that can start to be applied to agriculture. So you've got this kind of grain abundant economy as well. So there's this wholesale shift of the English economy where it's kind of reoriented around London, which starts to really, really, really grow from just about 50,000 people, which is kind of the medieval peak just before the Black Death, kind of reaches out again about 1500 to over 500,000 people, and then continuing to grow until it's in the period where Assassin's Creed Syndicate starts. London is like the biggest city in the world by far, easily, completely hands down. It's even bigger than some of the massive metropolises of China that in the 16th, 17th centuries would still have been quite a bit larger. But that continual growth, that continual urbanization, switch to new fuels, but also freeing up all that land for agriculture to feed more and more people, a larger and larger population. All of those are kind of signs that you start to see that those inventions are not only happening, but they're starting to kind of filter through to the whole economy.
And when we think of inventions, I guess we still think today of things being patented. You apply for a patent for something that's new. Is that something that we see kind of increasing during this period? Are there just more people registering ideas and new inventions?
Part of it is that, certainly. So in the late 16th century, so about 1550s, you start to see a real upsurge in the use of patents for industrial things. So you see it a lot with techniques for draining mines. It'll be all sorts of new water wheels, the kinds of stuff that we'd not even think of as being patentable today sometimes. There's various techniques, or even just the use of a new thing to make oil out of, like seed oils, that kind of thing. So a new seed would be, for oil, is the sort of thing that you'd see patented in the 17th, 18th centuries. So certainly you've got a bit of that. The only issue with that is that a lot of the patents that were granted in the very early stages are very much kind of royal privileges, right? So the letters patent, the patent just means kind of open rather than a closed letter. So like patently obvious is kind of open for everyone to see. So letters patent granted by the monarch means that you essentially need to be a courtier, or to have a courtier that you can pay or bribe to kind of get the Queen Elizabeth I's ear, or later, James I's ear, to grant you one of these things. And that becomes kind of the way in which a lot of invention is organized, at least in terms of if you want to raise quite a lot of capital for it. But the kind of modern system that we have today, where you can quite easily, just as an ordinary inventor, register a patent, that doesn't really start to emerge until the 19th century, where patenting becomes quite a bit cheaper, quite a bit easier. And then not really until the 1850s. So about 1852, there's a wholesale patent reform. The whole thing is made significantly cheaper and easier. And then you've just got this explosion of people registering everything and anything, even if a lot of that stuff doesn't work, So you end up with this kind of upsurge in stuff being registered. So in the early stages, there's probably more invention that's actually being recorded through the patent system, because a lot of people can't afford to get these courtiers to whisper in the monarch's ear. Whereas in the later period, you maybe got a lot of stuff that isn't really that inventive, is just being patented willy-nilly.
It's just kind of, I've got a good idea that might one day work, so I'll patent it just in case it's something.
Yeah, whereas you just wouldn't have been able to afford to do that before.
Yeah. And presumably this increase in the kind of numbers of inventions that are around and the types of developments that are going on means that there are more kind of applications for all that stuff. So these new inventions are being used increasingly to drive technological process, and it sort of becomes a self-propelling beast.
Absolutely, yeah. So to give a basic example that I referred to earlier, when you have a new invention that allows you to use coal in a process, that frees up all this extra agricultural land. That allows you to not only feed more people, but to feed more animals, which means that you can start to mechanize all sorts of other things just by, having horses going round and round and round, or oxen going round and round and round. A lot of the really famous inventions of the Industrial Revolution are not actually powered by steam, not until much later, until the 19th century. In the 18th century, the really famous kind of textile inventions, a lot of those things are actually just powered by hand or powered by animals. So having that kind of abundance of grain, which is the result of these previous inventions, allowing you to kind of have more and more animals to use for basic mechanized processes. And we're talking things like grinding paints, or grinding varnishes, or expressing oils from seeds. I mean, the list is absolutely endless in terms of the kinds of things. Anything where you might kind of need rotary motion, if you've got more plentiful animals, that's something you can do with it. To the extent that by about 1700, England is already looking pretty unusual to foreign visitors. Just the sheer number of calories that people and animals are able to consume means that horses are starting to get much bigger than elsewhere in Europe. People are starting to get much bigger than elsewhere in Europe. Not always upwards, but sideways as well. There's these hilarious comments from French visitors just aghast at the kind of length of English, what was dinner, and but actually starts extending more and more into the evening because people are sitting at it for so long. The kind of English belches and farts that you get because they're just having these absolutely huge meals. Almost kind of a bit like the way that Tolkien describes hobbits, just obsessed with food and just having more and more and more meals throughout the day. But also just the sheer proliferation of horses. because it's just so much cheaper and easier to feed all of them. So there's this great account from the 1780s of two sons of a French duke. One of them becomes this duke as well. So, we're talking really kind of high up French aristocracy, just amazed at how in England, even a poor farmer has a horse just to, go to town, rather than having to have horses that are pulling the plough always at work all the time. So almost kind of a luxury extra horse that they can afford. In the same way that I guess in the 1960s, people would be amazed at car ownership in the United States, in other countries, because it's just such a massive, rapid adoption of something that they see to be this kind of luxury, almost like an industrial thing, rather than something that people would just have a personal version of.
Obviously, Assassin's Creed Syndicate is set in London. We've been talking very much about the kind of British Age of Invention. Is it peculiar to Britain, or is this a worldwide phenomenon? Might other countries say that they had an Age of Invention that took place at a different time, or is it really peculiar to Britain?
In many ways, it is peculiar to Britain, in the sense that once it gets the Age of Invention in the 17th century, it sticks. And this is something you don't really see very often in human history, which is where you do have these what are often called efflorescences by economic historians, with kind of bubblings up of activity, of inventive activity. I mean, you can think of, there's the Islamic Golden Age, there's the Dutch Golden Age, there's various Golden Ages throughout history, but they're Golden Ages and they end. Right? Something happens and they kind of tail off. So, I mean, you can see this in the Dutch patenting record, is that it really starts to tail off suddenly in the late 17th century. So from about 1580s to about 1650s, 1660s, you've got this huge spate of activity, and then suddenly it almost kind of drops off a cliff and ends. Interestingly, a lot of historians have tried to look into why this occurs. It's not always, I think, there's not like a solid answer to it. There's various theories kind of floating around. But what's interesting about England is that once it even starts, it seems to just continue and continue and continue and continue, to the extent that, there hasn't really been any kind of big break in it all the way up to the present day. What's instead happened is that the kinds of efflorescence of invention that you've got in Britain starts to spread to other countries. It very rapidly spreads to the United States, or the nascent United States as it's kind of being born. I mean, think of Benjamin Franklin's, literally one of their founding fathers is an inventor, as well as being a founding father. You see a lot of the British inventions and institutions that support invention being transplanted to France, to various German principalities, by about the 1710s already, just showing just how early it is that Britain is starting to look unusual, to foreign visitors. You've got Russian, Spanish, French industrial spies, Swedish industrial spies all coming to Britain to figure out what the hell is going on. In the same way that I guess people would send delegations to Silicon Valley today to be like, what's in the water here? What is it what the hell is going on here? Why is this particular place so special? In the 18th century, that's London.
If it's hard to pin down kind of why these things blow up and end, is it possible to say what really drives the Age of Invention and why it sticks in Britain, or is that too sticky to pick apart?
There's a whole bunch of different theories. I'll give you mine. Britain is kind of accidentally lucky in that when it starts to get going in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the English crown is actually quite poor. Like, it really struggles to raise cash, to the extent that this kind of ends in the English Civil War, and that every time the monarch tries to raise money from Parliament gets a few more powers and gets increasingly kind of, doesn't really want to give all this extra taxation. And so because the crown is especially poor, I mean, even by European standards, if you look at other countries, particularly, they must have been extremely jealous of the French king, because a lot of their kind of tax-raising powers had emerged as early as the 15th century. So because in France you can get kind of this rise of absolutism, you don't really see the ability in England for the English crown and then the British crown to be able to do that on its own back. And the reason that's important is that a lot of the institutions that are developed over the course of the late 16th century in order to support invention end up being the kinds that are much more kind of broad-based. So they use a lot of patents, and it's free for the crown to write. Like, they literally say, here's a letter saying you have a monopoly over this thing. You're going to have to enforce it yourself. You're going to have to get investors from that, and I'm not going to give you any cash. Whereas in other countries, they'd say, oh, here's a pension, or here's a big reward for being an inventor, or come to the court and we'll pay for you to be here for a bit. And so it's quite an expensive thing. So because there isn't a lot of support for invention, when inventors do come to England, the way that they're supported is often with this very broad base of investors. They have to really make a lot of their invention public. And so, in order to gain shareholders, in order to gain investors, you basically have to kind of release some of the details of your invention. And I think what happens is that you end up with this kind of very robust print culture of invention by or already around 1600, where a lot of the inventions, we actually can read quite a lot about them because the inventors had to promote them to the public in order to gain some financial backing for them. So essentially, because you've got a weak crown, but because you do have this surge of invention, once it gets going, it has these very, very deep roots, to the extent that even if you have a monarch who's uninterested in invention, who doesn't care about, hiring a bunch of artisans and, having his court being the kind of center of attention for the world in terms of the science and all the technology and all this other stuff, that even when that happens, which does occasionally happen, right? George I is extremely uninterested in anything all that much cultural, except for maybe being the patron of Handel. So a bit of music, but otherwise he likes his hunting and he likes his women. But when you get those kinds of monarchs, it means that it doesn't matter, right? They don't actually need to always just have this single person who's supporting them. They have this much broader base of support. And I think it's that kind of thing that leads to this robustness. Once things get going, it means you've got these very, very deep roots, the kind of very deep support system that can continue to support invention as it keeps going.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's kind of a structural thing in the institutions of Britain that mean that the personality of the monarch is becoming less and less important. But that means that things like this can take hold. Whereas, in France, for example, where you have an absolutist monarch, if the king isn't interested, it simply doesn't happen. In Britain, there is still space for those things to happen, whether the monarch's interested or not.
Precisely, yeah. It's a very bottom-up model, and accidentally so in many ways, versus this very kind of top-down model. And the French always do it. Every time they see an institution that's developed in Britain that supports invention, they have a top-down version of it. So a great example from the 19th century would be mechanics institutions, which is workers, if they wanted to kind of, level up to a different class effectively, they wanted to, work as a clerk in an office, do some written work and, not have to haul things day and night. They kind of started to self-organize, not kind of like car mechanics today, but just meaning anyone who does mechanical rote hand work effectively, someone who's turning a crank or someone who's using their hands, any mechanical trade. They start to self-organize, creating educational institutions, pooling their savings to hire lecturers, get books, have these libraries. That's a very much a bottom-up thing. I mean, even today, Birkbeck University is effectively the descendant of the London Mechanics Institution, which is why it still has night classes. It's still very much an evening-focused university. Now, the French see that. They're incredibly impressed. I'm like, this is fantastic. The workers are educating themselves in England. It's one of the reasons they think that England is so advanced, because a lot of their workers are so educated, so they actually understand the science and behind the mechanisms, and so they can improve them, that they understand design, and that way they can improve the things that they're working on rather than just kind of doing the rote work. And so they just create a top-down version. They just say, the government will just fund a whole bunch of these institutions all over the country. They'll be free for everyone to attend, and we'll just have, a way to choose who can go to them, who can't. But ultimately, it's very much a top-down decision. And you see that again and again and again, that France just does it through the government. The problem is that if the French are unlucky enough that the rulers, those in charge, don't really care that much about it, then you're not going to get that progress. But in the 19th century, they very much start to worry that Britain has pulled ahead. And so they decide that they really need to up their game. To the extent that actually by the kind of period that the game is set in, Britain is actually kind of getting worried. A lot of people who promote invention are starting to get concerned that France is actually very rapidly catching up. And one of the reasons for that is that the French start to use something that the Brits hadn't really used at all, which is industrial exhibitions. The state, from very early on in France, so this is late 1790s, and then they do it every few years, right up until the 1840s and beyond, is that they just collect all of the inventions from all over the country, all of the mechanisms, have this great big exhibition of just national industry, if you like, so that the manufacturers can compare what everyone's doing. Consumers, when they're visiting, can say, okay, this product is better than this product from this region of France. We should have that too. Get their local producers to up their game, whereas the producers themselves, as exhibitors, are able to compare who's doing what and kind of improve and say, okay, well, up on the other side of the country, it seems as though they've got much better technique than we have. We'll adopt that. And so you get this engine of improvement from these exhibitions, these sort of focal points, to the extent that the Brits get very, very worried. And effectively what happens is it leads to the Great Exhibition of 1851, which is actually a copy of the French one. They pipped the French to it. They've been intending to do an international exhibition too, but because of the 1848 revolutions, it all gets delayed. And so the Brits suddenly swoop in. They say, okay, we're going to do the first, what ends up being the World's Fairs. We're going to do the very first one. And a lot of people think of the Great Exhibition as being this kind of glorifying thing about British industry, but actually it's not. It's all born of paranoia. It's that we need to compare British industry to what's going on in all other countries, get all of their manufacturers and machines all under the same roof so that we can jolt Britain out of complacency. So it's very much a kind of, this is how we can stay ahead in this very kind of open competition way, a bit like kind of organising kind of Olympics of industry, if you like, so that we can kind of jolt our own manufacturers into wanting to get these golds rather than having, just kind of laying back and letting the French catch up with us.
Yeah, fascinating. Just to bring it back to the game a little bit and offer a practical kind of example of this, we're looking at a scene from the game in which the players are introduced fairly early on to a guy called Alexander Graham Bell, who, quite a famous name. And he's got something on the table in front of him in the scene that we're looking at. I wondered if you could tell us what that is and why that's such an important invention. Why might the creators of Syndicate have decided to put that in the scene?
So it appears to be an electrical telegraph. I think it's a Morse telegraph by the looks of it. And I have to kind of think back to exactly when the Morse telegraph would have been used. So this is just having your kind of on-off switch and then developing a way in which you can kind of convert your dots and dashes into signals. What's interesting about the telegraph is originally would have had multiple dials or multiple wires. So the Morse code is actually a way of reducing the number of wires that you need.
So it's kind of an early example of the miniaturization of technology.
Absolutely, yeah. So it simplifies it, makes it much cheaper to lay telegraph cables. But it's an absolutely huge deal because it means that very quickly, especially when they start to lay marine telegraphs, so the first one being between, I think, Ireland and Newfoundland, so crossing the Atlantic's one of the shorter points. It means that you can start to have people conducting conversations in real time, pretty much, across continents. So the flow of information not only massively increases, but also means the flow of capital increases. Like, once you can send a buy order or a sell order across a continent, you can very quickly start to amass a fortune from just the kind of arbitrage opportunities that you get in one place versus another. So it really accelerates the pace of globalization in that capital can suddenly be deployed from a very wealthy place like Britain in the 19th century to essentially any continent in the world in just a matter of minutes rather than a matter of weeks, months, years.
And presumably that's quite a good example as well of one invention kind of fueling another. We would associate Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone. So I guess if you're looking at a telegraph like that does dots and dashes, it only takes someone to think, what if I could send a voice? And it's kind of one invention sort of leads to another. Is that right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the telegraph, it's a direct ancestor of a lot of the other breakthroughs of the late 19th century. You've got this very rapid period of experimentation and results in people managing to transfer voices, more complex sounds, and then very, very quickly images as well, right? So television, I think, very quickly follows on from that. But also the development in the very early 20th century of being able to do this stuff without wires. So the wirelessness of it is also extremely impressive. I think it's already by the 1880s, certainly, that you start to see teleprinting by wireless. I mean, they send messages from the top of the Eiffel Tower into places in London very early on, where they're able to just transfer text, without having to lay all these cables, without it having to be quite so complicated. So the period of kind of the information technology revolution that you get in the late 19th century really is transformative. And what's interesting actually is we associate it very much with electricity, and a lot of it does use electricity. But even before that, in the 1780s and 90s, interestingly, it's actually more of a French innovation. You start to see what are essentially manual telegraphs or non-electric telegraphs, a series of towers where different signals can be transferred across very long distances very rapidly, essentially for the military or for the government, where because of the telescope, as long as you can which is a much older invention, dates back to the early 17th century, because a telescope, as long as you've got a tower and you've got a telescope on another tower, you can see what someone's waving with their flags or with their mechanical means of communication. Semaphore is actually another version of the kind of miniaturized version of this, the use on ships. All of that is very new stuff, which could have been done much, much, much earlier. Could have been done hundreds of years earlier. As early as the telescope, easily. But it's something that, again, just takes a while for people to even think of it as something that could be a big breakthrough for them to use. But very rapidly, the moment they start applying electrical current to the same sort of signals, you see already in the 1820s and 30s, so much experimentation to move this thing along.
I love the idea of early human-based Wi-Fi, sending semaphore messages by people across great distances. I wondered if you could maybe talk us through some of the key inventions and the key inventors. You mentioned electricity there, which obviously is something that drives things on, but we think today about, imagery, photography and things like that. Are these all things that come out of the Age of Invention too?
Absolutely. Almost all of them, I think, have a root in that period, in that someone at some point is doing some kind of experimentation that then leads to quite dramatic further results. So the famous photography pioneers would be Louis Daguerre in France, and then William Henry Fox Talbot in Britain. So this is 1839 to kind of early 1840s. They're coming up with ways to fix images. Interestingly, there's actually a kind of really fun alternative history that could have happened, which is that it all actually could have happened about 20 years earlier, because Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, very famous innovator in ceramics, as well as in kind of retail practices, I suppose. But his son, Thomas Wedgwood, is already doing some really early experiments in fixing images, and he dies young. He dies, I think, in his early 30s. So there's potentially a kind of alternative history where photography actually appears much, much, much earlier, and we end up with loads of photographs from an even earlier period. But because he dies young, perhaps, it's delayed by a few decades and waits for another few inventors to take up his mantle. So photography is a huge one. In telegraphy, I'd say Cooke and Wheatstone are really kind of push things forward in terms of the application of electricity to it. Another really big one that's almost entirely unsung is the application of steam engines to printing. So the reason the Times is still one of the major newspapers is because they were one of the very first adopters, I think the first adopter of, as a newspaper, of steam-powered printing presses, invented by a German guy who emigrated to England to promote his inventions, called Friedrich Koenig. So the Koenig press was an absolutely huge deal. And a lot of people at the time at the presses were pretty worried about it. So they actually had to apply it in secret. They printed that edition of it in secret and then released it with a big justification for what they'd just done on the front page, saying, we've had to do this, but we knew that people would try to sabotage it along the way. We know it's going to make certain people unemployed in terms of certain tasks, but we're going to take those same workers and we're going to give them, more tasks for, doing the composing where the letters are going to go. And it kind of creates more jobs around it. So it's a really striking example of how a newspaper can really kind of gain the edge over all of its rivals, and by being able to print so much faster than ever before. I would even say, going back still further, you've got dramatic improvements in the ability to measure things, which then leads to all these other later results. The 17th century is also the period where you see the invention of thermometers and increasingly accurate thermometers, the invention of telescopes, development of microscopes. The ability to measure things with increasing precision means that stuff later on can start to be mass manufactured. Today, we expect nearly every product to come out looking pretty much the same as any other from the same manufacturer, but that's kind of completely unheard of just a few hundred years ago, because everything would have to be made from scratch by hand. So think of like the copper engravings for printing. Like these things get worn out and have to be re-engraved. You have to have new plates all the time. So being able to mass manufacture things so that they can be done in a way where you have interchangeable parts, for example, all of that is completely new during this period as well. And a lot of unsung inventors just before the kind of period of the game, in terms of the people who are responsible for that kind of mechanization, people like Henry Maudsley, Joseph Whitworth, so people still know of the Whitworth rifle. Isambard Kingdom Brunel's father, Mark Brunel, who's a French emigre, so he flees, I think, the French Revolution, first to the United States and then to Britain. And he's responsible for all sorts of kind of mass manufacturing innovations, most notably in the manufacture of ship's pulleys, and also mass manufacture of boots, which is, really important for the soldiers who are tramping up and down in the Napoleonic Wars. So it's exactly in that kind of same period. So you've got a lot of these lesser known inventors who are really responsible for quite dramatic breakthroughs. I could go on and on and on, because the big deal with the Age of Invention, with the Industrial Revolution that results from it, is that it actually applies to basically every and any field that you can think of. I mean, some inventors are even doing stuff that we wouldn't really even kind of consider industrial invention, where clergymen who are coming up with ways to categorize and improve the quality of hymns, even landscape gardening. One of the most famous ones of the 18th century is a guy called Capability Brown, Lancelot Capability Brown. The capability meaning that he would look out across a vista and say, oh yes, very capable, meaning of improvement, right? That this is a great big field that he thinks, oh yeah, I can definitely do something with this. This kind of improving mentality is what I call it, this kind of optimizing mentality. So that mentality becomes so widespread across so many different industries that really it's quite difficult sometimes to pick out what is a big breakthrough, because there's just such a huge number of them that those big breakthroughs are dependent upon, but also that they cause.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think of it as kind of a flood, a waterfall, rather than a single spark that will ignite a fire. We've got the water flooding in here, and it's just so much going on all at the same time. And I wondered as well, you talked then a little bit about the Age of Invention sort of leading to the Industrial Revolution. How are they different? Are they inextricably linked? Does the Age of Invention lead directly to the Industrial Revolution?
In a way, I think they're kind of synonyms. So a lot of the time when people talk about the Industrial Revolution, what they actually mean is the acceleration of innovation. Like, it is the direct cause of it. There's nothing else that could possibly have caused such a sustained, continuous level of economic growth. So when we think of the Industrial Revolution, we think of, I guess, a lot of the stuff that's portrayed in the game, right? So, smoke belching chimneys, child labour, kind of Dickensian hellscape, really kind of rough London full of soot and, steam and coal and iron and maybe cotton to an extent as well, right? That's what we think of. We think of this kind of late stage of the Industrial Revolution. So really kind of a mid to late 19th century version of it. But actually, that's just a kind of follow-on from all the stuff that had been going on beforehand. It's a very obvious, direct kind of continuation of some slightly earlier trends. I don't mean this in a kind of trite historical way where everything has to, come from something earlier, but it's like, it's a very obvious continuation of things that had been developing just a few decades before. That's the kind of image we have of the Industrial Revolution, but focusing on that image is kind of focusing on the effects of it, right? What we're actually seeing is this dramatic transformation of the English and then British economies to become significantly more urbanized, significantly more industrial. And actually a lot of that takes place already by 1700, right? Visitors to Britain in 1700, as early as that, are already saying something dramatic has happened here. It looks completely different to other countries. And I think historically as well, as an economic historian, it really is kind of impressive what happens, which is that, to put it in these terms, England is a net grain exporter for the entire 16th and much of the 17th centuries, right? So it's basically an agrarian economy, and it's very much an agrarian economy in the early 16th century, so let's say 1540s, 1550s, but continues to be a grain exporter. And yet, what usually happens with economies that tend to produce a lot of raw materials like that, things like grain that then are just consumed elsewhere, is that they specialize in that. There's this economic concept called Dutch disease, which is that if you're already kind of really good at something, you end up being kind of forced into that specialization, which is that an agrarian economy often becomes more agrarian, right? And which is exactly what happens, say, to the Baltic states, kind of the coast of Poland, Lithuania, all the way up, throughout the Baltic. A lot of the Baltic is essentially a major grain producer for the rest of Europe, all the way down to the Mediterranean. And it continues to specialize in that, and you see very little industry emerging as a result. England not only continues to export, but has this dramatic shift into industry, shift into cities, shift into loads of other different industries as well, despite maintaining that edge as a major grain exporter. I don't think that's ever happened before in human history, before it happening to England and then Britain in this period. not even to mention the dramatic urbanization, or really Londonization of the economy, in that a single city ends up growing so much more rapidly than all the other ones. And then in the kind of late 18th century, a lot of other cities start to emerge, like Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Glasgow, Bristol, Liverpool. A lot of those really start to grow only at kind of tail end, if you like, of the flood. So as the flood continues to gush out, London kind of reaches such a massive size that you end up seeing a lot of industrial activity moving elsewhere to other parts of the country as well. So yeah, I think the Industrial Revolution effectively is the same thing. In a way, the term Industrial Revolution is one of those ones that every historian who studies it complains about it, because we're stuck with it and everyone knows what it is, but it's kind of unhelpful as a descriptor of the kinds of phenomena that we're trying to talk about.
Yeah, it sounds like we're looking into the same room, but maybe through a different window, just calling it a different name.
Yeah, that's a nice analogy for it.
How much of an impact does all of this change have on the everyday lives of ordinary people? So in the game, people are riding trains. Does that open up a world of travel that was never really there before? Do we see changes in medical technology that actually improve ordinary people's lives?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely huge. I think it's almost impossible to even put ourselves in the shoes of people at the time. I'm going to give a really basic example that's going to sound really kind of boring, but I think is actually just shows the sheer scale of the improvement, which is that today, most people in relatively wealthy countries spend about 10 to 15% of their annual income on food and drink. And not kind of including eating out, but just their basic kind of everyday food and drink needs. Even in the poorest countries in the world, I think it's Democratic Republic of Congo has the highest proportion spent on food and drink, and it's about 50% of their income. To everyone living, unless you're extremely wealthy, we're talking a very tiny group of people, to pretty much everyone living in 1600, even kind of 1650s up to 1700, you're spending easily about 75% of your income on food, right? So to put that in perspective, if we were to take today's income and spend the amount that they're spending on food, you're going to be absolutely, drowning in bread, because nearly all of it's, on really basic foodstuffs like bread, with maybe a few luxuries kind of, put in there too. Bread and beer, which is like your main source of calories, right? You'd be drowning in bread. Your whole house would be absolutely full of bread if you're spending, even the median wage in Britain, or especially in America, on just bread and beer. So that, I think, alone kind of shows the sheer scale of the improvement, that it's become so normal for us to be able to purchase other things. That kind of improvement in no longer needing to, scrabble just to be able to eat, I think is absolutely huge and dramatic, and noticed at the time as well. And that people really, really do start to, I mentioned earlier that people are, English people are becoming famous throughout Europe for, becoming extremely fat and eating huge meals. I mean, that is immediately kind of the most obvious sign at increasing living standards. Right? Because the first thing that people who are extremely poor will buy is going to be more and better food, right? Higher quality food. I mean, even to the extent, and this again sounds like a really boring small change, but is absolutely gigantic at the time in terms of, like, it's almost immeasurable as a shift in living standards, is that foreign visitors are amazed that in England, basically everyone eats wheat bread, right? Not rye, not barley, not oats, which are kind of considered, oats are almost in England considered like food for livestock, food for horses. The English down in London make fun of the Scots for eating oats so much because it's seen as like a kind of grain of the poor. But people are visiting England and they're saying, I can't believe everyone just, like, literally everyone, even the poorest of the poor, are eating wheaten bread. Because that's like the premium grain. I guess it's a bit like if everyone visited today and instead of eating kind of really kind of stodgy processed stuff, they're like eating from Gales or something, some really upmarket place. But they're eating that as like every single day, and it's like super affordable, and absolutely everyone is using it. Like, that's the kind of scale of the living standards improvement. So things like trains and telegraphs, I mean, yeah, those are all huge as well. But I think just in the kind of the basic living standards that people are experiencing, the food they're eating, the drink they're drinking, the houses they're living in, the ability to heat themselves, to clothe themselves, all of those undergoing absolutely huge changes in a way that I think, because we're so wealthy now as a result of all of those changes, it's like almost impossible for us to put ourselves in the mindset of someone who's experiencing that change at the time.
Yeah. I mean, you say that's kind of a small example, but it's absolutely seismic, isn't it? And it just shows the really deep and broad impact of all of that change coming together to generate the world that we live in today, almost.
Yeah, I mean, we're still riding the wave of improvement from it.
I just wondered, we've talked a lot about kind of the upsides and the progress and everything else. Were there downsides to this? Were people worried? You mentioned a little bit earlier about people being worried about jobs in the presses and things like that. Were there kind of ethical and moral problems with all of this that people were confronted by?
Yeah, from the start as well. I mean, one thing that you see in a lot of really early patents is usually a clause that allows it to be revoked if it's seen as inconvenient. And that's such a broad thing that it basically means if it's making people unemployed, if it's, destroying an industry, if it's raising prices too much because it's monopolized an industry, a lot of these things are essentially used as grounds for patents to be revoked. And they can be revoked like that because it's literally just the monarch has said you have this monopoly. If the monarch says you don't have this monopoly, then that's that, it's gone. And you end up with a lot of the petitions that you see for patents. They often take great pains to say how it's not going to affect existing industries. And that's actually one of the really important things about the justification for those monopolies, is that they have to be for something new, a new trade that creates jobs rather than something that destroys jobs. As I mentioned with the steam printing press, you do see inventions that are extremely disruptive to people's livelihoods. And I think by the 19th century, you kind of get this attitude that a lot of people are saying, well, we shouldn't be letting stuff stand in the way of the progress, that some level of unemployment, technological unemployment, is desirable in order for these things to continue to be invented, in order for them to be applied, because of the impact on living standards more broadly. That just because a few people have a certain job that they're used to, we should privilege them.
I guess that's not a million miles away from the discussions that we have today around AI. We're having that same kind of discussion about it will put people out of jobs, but is that a reason not to progress it?
Yeah. And what's amazing is how old the arguments are. I mean, I've seen stuff talking in the late 16th century, as early as that, literally making the argument, well, would you have not invented the printing press because of the scribes? Literally people were using those examples for them about 100 years earlier, as early as that, saying, that's not a good enough argument given the massive effects that it can potentially have. But yes, you do have the arguments going back and forth, and you do end up with, very early on, you do have organized resistance sometimes. You do see machine breaking. The Luddites are the kind of famous example of this. But you also have the Captain Swing riots against agricultural mechanization, which I think is late 1820s. You see the much, much, much earlier in the 1670s and 80s. I've read some of the testimonies from people, which was quite harrowing actually, reading the testimonies from the people affected by basically being threatened by the silk weavers because of some small changes in the kind of weaving technologies, a bit more mechanization going on where, people are coming to their houses, threatening their families, saying, we're going to beat you up. We're potentially even going to kill you for trying to implement these technologies that are going to affect our livelihoods. So it really goes back a long way. And what's interesting, though, is that in general, it appears as though I think the kind of desirability of invention in a broad sense does tend to convince politicians at the time and policymakers. And they do, broadly speaking, tend to come down on the side of, we want more invention, we want more technology, which is not necessarily always the case in all countries. But there are limits to that, right? That very often, as I said, those patents have those clauses because sometimes guilds do complain and they say, this is not something that we want, or if you're going to allow it, there needs to be some kind of payoff. You see the same with canals and railways, and that, a lot of these things have to be built in a way that goes over people's existing property. You get an act of parliament that overrides their property rights because parliament literally has supreme power, can do absolutely anything it wants. But in all of those acts, you end up with some kind of compensation being paid to the people who've had their property kind of overridden. If you're going to make a river more navigable, you have to pay the people using that water, the millers, to not always kind of hoard all the water in their own kind of, siphoning it off for themselves all the time. So you have to kind of make allowances there. And so there is a lot of attempt to try and kind of square that circle, make sure that people do get kind of some kind of compensation so that they don't stand in the way all the time.
Is it possible to put a pin in the kind of the end of the Age of Invention? I've seen 1851, which is the year of the Great Exhibition, suggested as a potential end to it. But when you think about the amount of change that we're still living through today, kind of from the mid-20th century to today, the world is almost unrecognisable. Are we still in an Age of Invention, or do we need to end one and start another one?
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely are. Basically, it hasn't stopped since. I think the British Age of Invention spread to the rest of the world, or was emulated or copied in the rest of the world. I mean, sometimes, literally by sending people from the other side of the world, from the Tata, the founder of Tata Steel in India, he came to Britain. He looked at all the techniques and was like, we can do this back home. The Japanese would send people to America, to Britain, to Germany, to France to learn from the way that invention was organized, that the engineering was all being done, brought it back home, and you end up with, things like Toyota and mass manufacturing and mechanization going on the other side of the world. It's absolutely still happening. I think you can even trace very easily often the kind of genealogy of inspiration of which inventor has inspired which inventor all the way back. For all of today's inventors, you can easily trace them all the way back, I think, into the 17th century very often, at least where there are records of it. I mean, this is something I'm extremely interested in personally, that a lot of my work has been kind of traced that genealogy of inspiration, which is not necessarily the same technologies, but people kind of getting that improving mentality, which they can then apply to absolutely anything and everything. Because a lot of the inventors at the time they're not just people siloed in a particular industry. In the same way that today, a lot of people who get involved in invention, they have one project, they have another project, they have a side project. They like to improve everything and anything because they start noticing room for improvement. The genealogy, the ancestry, if you like, of the improvement mentality, I think it's very easy often to trace all the way back, certainly to the 18th century. And then even when the records become a bit sparse in the 17th, you start to notice that, this person, before they started inventing, also knew this other inventor, or kind of went round to their house, or was, that was their uncle happened to be another inventor, and they were actually quite good friends. There's all these sorts of different connections that you start to notice, and not just the kind of them when they become inventors seeking others out, which also happens, right? So you do also have the rise of institutions like the Lunar Society at Birmingham, where existing inventors all kind of get together and, hang out with one another and inspire one another, and try to, find common feeling in the way that people would find common feeling as hobbyists and, wanting to hang out with people who share their passions. It's unhelpful in a way to say that the Age of Invention has continued to right to this day, and it continues to continue, and maybe even accelerating even further, right? You mentioned AI. Maybe it's going to get ever easier to become an inventor. I suspect that today there are way more inventors alive, both in absolute numbers and per capita, than at any other point in human history. Easily, right? Especially all the world over. So in many ways, maybe it's only just getting started.
Yeah, it's been absolutely fascinating to try and get under the skin of this period a bit more. And I think, I'm inspired to try to understand it better, because it's clearly the very deep roots of the world that we live in today. So much of what we live in today, you've pinpointed back centuries into this age of invention, and the reason that we enjoy some of the things that we probably take for granted today is because people a few hundred years ago were relentlessly driving this improvement. And before we finish, I always like to offer guests the opportunity to step into the Assassin's Creed animus and travel back in time a little bit. So is there a particular moment during the Age of Invention, an invention that you'd like to witness, or a person that you would like to meet from that period?
Yes. The person I'd like to meet is a guy almost unheard of, but absolutely fundamental to so many inventions, a guy called Cornelis Drebbel. He's a Dutch inventor. He comes to England in the 1590s, early 1600s. It's kind of unusual that he's employed by the court, and he's at the court of Prince Henry, which is James I's eldest son, who dies young. So Charles I ends up inheriting, but there's actually a Henry who would have been Henry IX, and he has a tutor who's actually a major investor in inventions and is surrounded by all these inventors. So you potentially would have had the kind of inventor king of Henry IX had he not died young. But Drebbel, the thing that he brings to the court is an invention which is essentially a perpetual motion, but it's actually not a perpetual motion. It's effectively a kind of it's a barometer really, that exploits changes in atmospheric pressure and temperature in order to drive a clock mechanism, which, by the way, has been done since. Like, there are actually 18th century versions. There's a 20th century version called the Atmos clock. So it's been done since. But his appears to be the original. He's effectively, by exploiting atmospheric pressure, one of the early, really interesting steam engine pioneers, right? Because the early steam engines, the Newcomen engine, they exploit atmospheric pressure, right? They're actually not steam powered in the sense. What happens is they exploit the condensation of steam under a piston, which is then exploiting the weight of the atmosphere to drive the piston. Right, and so he's applying this to mechanized, to a clock, basically, a really complex clock that's showing the zodiac and the movement of the sun and the moon and all these other things. Really, really early on, exploiting what he calls the perpetual motion of the universe itself, right? The changes in weather in order to drive this microcosm. It's called the Elton Wonder, and I'd love to take a look at it. If I got to use the Animus, I'd like to actually look at it because we know kind of roughly how it may have worked. We don't have the surviving one. We don't have any really detailed drawings of it. I'd love to see one in person. And also to chat to him because, as well as doing that, he's responsible for a really early successful submarine, which is trialled in the 1620s in the Thames. He apparently goes down for hours with a whole bunch of different people. I have no idea how he managed it. He was a real whiz with chemicals, so it's possible that he was... one theory, which I think is almost outlandish, but is potentially true, is that he is extracting with a very low heat oxygen from saltpeter, which is pretty explosive, but in order for the people under the water to be able to breathe for a very extended period of time. He's developing all sorts of new weapons, which we don't really know how they worked, but they're applied in the 1620s in some of the wars that England very unsuccessfully Charles I has with Spain and France. Because of the application of atmospheric pressure, he invents what's effectively the thermostatic oven. So being able to set your oven to be a constant temperature, he seems to be responsible for that, which means that you can then start applying heating to all sorts of really mild things like drying malt to be used in beer, to incubating eggs, to hatch chickens, right? So all of these kind of very finessed things with heating, he's responsible for. So there's an Italian inventor called Santorio Santorio who invents the thermometer in a kind of way where he's taking basically the Drebbel instrument and then putting bars on it and saying we can actually measure the temperature by looking at the change in the water going up and down. Only later in the 1640s they work out that they need to separate the temperature from the barometric pressure, from the atmospheric pressure. But using both at the same time, so you end up with a kind of Italian thermometer, but also what's called often the Drebbelian instrument, or in Dutch it's the Donderglas, the thunder glass, because it shows, because as a barometer will show the impending storm. So he's also kind of one of the major inventors of the barometer. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention that Drebbel, you've heard of the British Redcoats. He's also the guy who invents, with his son-in-law, a guy called Kuffler, the red dye that ends up being mass manufactured and ends up being the kind of the famous red that becomes so intimately associated with Britain. Almost unheard of today, completely unsung, but I think so many things come back specifically to his very particular genius that I'd love to meet him.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great answer, and I think I might have to come with you because he sounds absolutely fascinating. He must be a great guy to have sat down in the pub and had a pint with and say, what are you working on today? Because it would be something completely mind-blowing. But it's been absolutely fascinating to get under the skin of this period a little bit more. So thank you so much for joining us, Anton, and sharing all of those insights into the age of invention that has had such an impact on the world we live in today. Thank you. Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes.